Welcome to the 2013 Mini-Psych session. Dear students, this is our 8th year. We're very proud of this. Over the past 8 years, more than 800 students have come through this class, and more than 800,000 people have seen the Mini-Psych classes on YouTube. So it's quite an accomplishment for us, and we're happy that the tradition is continuing in this. We decided this year to go with a special theme, a theme about women's mental health. We thought it was important to start addressing subgroups of individuals who have certain issues going through life. And as Michelle Obama said, we need to do a better job of putting ourselves higher on our multiple to-do lists. So that's what we're doing this time. The 4 next classes will be on mental health of women. Our speakers this year include a clinical psychologist, Dr. Valentina Munoz, who will be speaking tonight. On anxiety, we'll have a neuroscientist, Dr. Dominic Walker, who will be speaking on hormones and brain through the lifespan, a psychiatrist, Dr. Mimi Israel, who a lot of you probably already know from having given previous classes in the Mini-Psych School, who will be talking about body image and self-esteem, and a sleep disorder specialist, Dr. Diane Boivin, who actually just got a book out last year on developing good sleeping habits. So tonight we start off with anxiety. How telling. I'll give you a short bio sketch of our first guest speaker. Valentina Munoz has her PhD in psychology from the University of Montreal. She's a clinical psychologist and a clinical supervisor at the Anxiety Disorders Clinic here at the Douglas. She provides a lot of training to other mental health professionals regarding treating anxiety, cognitive behavior approaches, and she also has her private practice in Old Montreal. A summary of tonight's presentation. She'll be addressing what the differences are between normal and dysfunctional anxiety. Is there such a thing as normal anxiety? Are women more vulnerable to anxiety than men? And what are the gender differences and what explain them? She'll also be talking about common pitfalls in dealing with anxiety disorders and how to get rid of that vicious cycle of going in and out of them. Why are the life values important and how can they give meaning to change when we have anxiety issues?
I'm very happy to be here and to be able to discuss the topic of anxiety and women. And as Anne just told you, we'll be going through some different themes this evening. But before we start, just by a show of hands, I'd like you to tell me how many people here have experienced anxiety at any point in their lives? Okay. Now, how many of you consider yourselves chronic worriers, or at least know one? Either yourself or you know someone who you feel is a chronic worrier. Okay? And finally, how many of you here have ever tried to face your fears, but you didn't get the expected result? Okay. So hopefully with what we're going to cover tonight, we're going to have a few answers to these questions by the end of the evening. So let's start with adaptive anxiety. What is adaptive anxiety? Is there such a thing? Yes, there is. And I'm glad that all of you raised your hand when I asked if you had experienced anxiety. So adaptive anxiety is basically an alarm reaction that's there to protect you, to allow you to survive, and to allow you to go through your daily life and pretty much stay alive. Just to give you a quick example, let's say I'm about to cross the street and I see a car coming. And as I see the car coming, I react and I back up. That's my anxiety telling me that there's a real threat and I need to do something about it. Another example could be, let's say I lose my job and I start getting really anxious and stressed because I think that in a few weeks from now I may start having financial difficulties. So what the anxiety is going to do is that it's going to mobilize me so that I can do problem solving. And then once the problem is solved, the anxiety is going to go away. So adaptive anxiety is very useful. And it usually goes away once you've kind of adapted to the situation. Now, anxiety is expressed in many ways. One of the ways it's expressed is, of course, by your emotions. It's the way you feel. But it's also the way you think, what goes through your mind. You also your anxiety girl in the papers that you were sent. So the worst case scenario, right? Another way anxiety is expressed is through your body. So there's actual physical sensations to anxiety. It could be shaking, sweating, blurry vision. And then the last way anxiety is expressed is through your behaviors. So if I'm afraid of something, if I'm feeling anxious about something, I'm going to do things in a certain way. So in order to manage your anxiety properly, you need to actually know how to manage well all these different facets of anxiety. Now, what happens when anxiety becomes dysfunctional? When anxiety becomes dysfunctional, it becomes an exaggerated alarm response to either real danger or an imagined danger. So what happens is your brain doesn't care if it's real or not. You just need to tell your brain that there's something dangerous and it'll believe you. And this is where anxiety can start becoming dysfunctional. It's when you keep asking it to call 911, but there's no real threat. This is where you can slowly slip into dysfunctional anxiety, okay? So I'm thinking of one of my clients who was extremely afraid of having a heart attack. And so we did the whole medical thing. She got tested, normal heart condition, but she kept refusing to go work out because she really thought that when her heart palpitations would go up, she was putting herself at risk for a heart attack. This is what we would call dysfunctional anxiety. She's calling 911 when she doesn't need to. And now her lifestyle is actually affected by this. Now, the way I'm describing it to you sounds very kind of clear-cut. There's normal anxiety, dysfunctional anxiety. I think we all know that this is not how it happens in real life. It's a little bit more complicated. I would invite you to look at this a little bit like a continuum. So there's adaptive anxiety, and then we can sometimes have a little bit of dysfunctional anxiety or not so well adapted anxiety. And then we can slowly move into very, very dysfunctional anxiety to the point where we may eventually develop, for example, an anxiety disorder. So I won't talk too much about anxiety disorders tonight, but just to give you a few examples, I'm sure you've heard about a few of these. So for example, obsessive compulsive disorder, social phobia, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. This is where your life is being ruled by the anxiety. And this is where very specific strategies need to be used to kind of be able to get out of that, okay? So although I presented anxiety in two kind of very separate categories, I would really invite you to see it more as a continuum. Now, why give special attention to women? So what research is showing us right now is that women are 2 times more vulnerable than men to report anxiety. It seems that we're also more vulnerable to report anxiety in a lot more life areas. So we worry about finances, about family, about work, whereas for men it seems to be more focused. We also seem to report more negative emotions than men. And by negative emotions, I mean emotions like self-criticism, rumination, overanalyzing. So it really puts us in a bit of a tough spot. Let's look at why we do this. One of the first reasons we do this, it's unfortunately because of hormones. So the first culprit is testosterone. It's been shown in research that testosterone actually protects us from feeling anxious and stressed. And as women, we have less testosterone than men. Now, there's recent research that's also showing us that there's a hormone that's secreted when we're stressed that's called corticotrophin. And we secrete it as women, and men also secrete it. But men are quite good at protecting themselves from that hormone, whereas we're not. We are like oversensitive to that hormone. So just speaking of hormones, we're set up in a way where we're a bit of a disadvantage. That's the bad news. The good news is that most of the differences between men and women are explained by cultural biases and socialization. Now, I say the good news because it means that these are things that we can change. Just a few insightful facts. In infancy, boys are usually more needy than girls. By the age of 2, girls are usually reporting more negative emotions than little boys. This is because of gender role learning. Until age 11, we see that boys and girls usually have about the same probability of developing an anxiety disorder. And only 4 years later, girls are 6 times more at risk for developing an anxiety disorder. And when we control for hormones, we see that this is not really explained by hormones. It's not because they're teenagers and there's hormones all over the place. It's because of the way we're socializing them and because of the cultural biases we have. To give you kind of a very quick example, when little girls get hurt, we usually have a tendency to hug them, to ask them to talk about it, all sorts of things like that. Little boys are encouraged to kind of suck it up and get back in there. I'm not saying they don't have other issues, but when it comes to anxiety, we're more at risk. Another interesting study shows that women are labeled as more emotional than men, even though they report the exact same level of emotional distress. So let's say I have the results from 2 questionnaires. One's from a man, one's from a woman. The results are exactly the same. I will rate the woman as more emotional than the man just because she's a woman. And it's not men doing this to us only. We're actually doing this to ourselves. So even though we may have the same results objectively, we're rating them differently because of gender. So what happens is that women just end up with less effective coping strategies when it comes to anxiety. Now, before I move on to the ways we usually mismanage anxiety, I also want to talk a little bit about our strengths. Just see a few faces here. I don't want you to get depressed. So what we find in women is they're actually a lot more honest about stress and about how they feel. So that's a good thing. Another thing we find in women is that they're way more likely to seek help than men. And another result that's I think is pretty interesting is that women may have different coping strategies, but usually they won't use drugs and alcohol as much as men do. Now, I picked a few ways that really illustrate the way we mismanage anxiety in our everyday lives. And what I'll do is I'll present the way we mismanage it, and then I'm going to follow up with how to kind of fix that, okay? So the first way we mismanage anxiety is avoidance. It's kind of natural. I get it. You feel distress, you feel anxious, it feels bad. You want the feeling to stop, so you stay away, right? Makes sense. However, it makes a little bit less sense when your lifestyle or your quality of life takes a hit. What happens when we avoid is that we keep teaching our brain that what we're avoiding is probably dangerous. So our brain can never learn that maybe, just maybe, it's not threatening and it's not dangerous. And maybe it would be okay to approach it. When I talk about it could be anything. It could be an object, it could be a situation, it could be an interpersonal interaction, right? Think of things that make you anxious and make you avoid. I remember this client once who her dream job was to get a job on TV. And she actually went to an interview and she got the job. And then I got a call. And she said, I got the job of my dreams. I'm not sure I'm going to take it. I said, why? Congratulations. She said, I'm so afraid of having a panic attack in front of the camera that I think I might actually not take it. Do you see how the avoidance makes you walk away from what's important to you? This is where anxiety becomes dysfunctional. Now, I'm going to teach you step by step how to face your fears, but before I do that, I want you to think of something, okay? Just think of something in your own lives that you're afraid of. It can be an object, a situation, a person, a certain interaction with somebody that makes you feel uncomfortable and that you've been avoiding, a certain phone call you don't want to make, okay? Think about that. And I want you to think of that situation and what it would look like as I take you through the steps of how to face your fears, okay? Now, facing your fears. We hear this all the time, right? It's very mainstream. Face your fear. We see it on logos. Our friends say that, face your fear. And I'm sure a lot of us try and face our fears. But the truth is, there's a right way to face your fear. There's a lot of wrong ways to face your fear. And I often have clients who come into my office, and then when I talk to them about facing their fear, they tell me, been there, done that, didn't work. I'm not going there again. I understand. So, okay, let's frame this in a different way. So the idea here is, I understand, and I believe them. I know they tried to face their fear, but they faced it in a way where they shot themselves in the foot. Not only did they shoot themselves in the foot, but they ended up actually being even more scared. So the fear now actually became bigger. Because when you face your fear in a way that's not productive, you end up being even more scared. So think of the situation I asked you to think about as I take you through the steps. The first step, you've already done it. Pick a situation, something concrete, okay? So just try and narrow it down and focus on one specific situation that matters to you, that you really believe is going to increase your quality of life, something that's meaningful, okay? Now, once you've picked that situation, what I want you to do is I want you to design a situation that looks a little bit like the one you're thinking of, but that's not as anxiety-provoking. I'll give you an example, very typical example I see with my clients who have panic attacks. They refuse to take the metro. They haven't taken the metro in years. They decide that their objective is to start taking the metro again because it has an impact on their autonomy, on their finances, because now they have to take taxis everywhere. It's just taking kind of more and more space in their lives. So what they tell me is, there's no way I can take the metro, that I cannot face that fear. I say, okay, what about we go in the metro station together, we sit on the bench and we look at the metros. Oh, I wouldn't like that too much, but that I think I can do. So do you see how you can find something that's not too far off from what you want, but that's a little bit less scary? So there's two conditions here. The first one is, you do want to create some distress. You do want to create some anxiety. But the second condition is, you need to feel in control and you need to feel that it's manageable, okay? So that's the second step. Design a situation where there's anxiety present, but it's manageable. The third condition is no surprises. This is a big one where my clients shoot themselves in the foot. They decide they're gonna face their fear the day that they have a doctor's appointment at the other end of the city, and they don't want to cancel the appointment because, they're never going to get another appointment with that doctor. They have no more money, so they have to take the metro. They figure, I'm going to face my fear today. Bad idea. Too much pressure. When you decide to face your fear, that's the objective, facing your fear. It's not to get to something else later that day, okay? So you want to do it deliberately. You want to pick a time and a day and go and sit in the metro station and look at the metros, and you have nothing scheduled after. No pressure there, no surprises. This is when you start changing the relationship with anxiety, where you start controlling instead of the anxiety controlling you, okay? Now, the other thing is you need to stay there until the anxiety decreases. This is why I always tell my clients, don't plan something 15 minutes later. Allow yourself a good buffer of time so that you can actually stay until the anxiety decreases. This is where you start reteaching your brain that these things are not dangerous. What happens, what most of my clients do is that they do exposures, they face their fears with their eyes closed and their fingers crossed. And they just want it to end. And they just can't wait for it to end, and then the doors open of the metro and they run out. This is when they shoot themselves in the foot. I'd rather you pick something that's less anxiety-provoking, but where you can just stay there until the anxiety drops. It doesn't need to drop fully. It can drop to maybe a 3 on 10, a 2 on 10, that's good enough. But this is where your brain is learning that it's okay, that nothing's gonna happen. If you don't stay in it, if you actually leave when the anxiety is high, this is when my clients tell me, oh, I tried that, I'm never doing that again. It got even worse. They're right, it did get worse, because you left when the anxiety was high, okay? Now, the last 2 steps is, my rule of thumb is I ask them to do this once a day. So just like you would brush your teeth, you face your fear once a day. If you can't do it once a day, well, once every 2 days, but as often as possible. The reason why I want you to do it as often as possible is because I want you to be able to get to the next step quickly enough so that you don't lose your motivation. If you do this once a day, you'll see that it won't take that many days for you to actually get through that. It's very rare that my clients have to sit there and watch the metro for a month. Usually about 2 or 3 times later, they're ready to go to the next step, which could be, for example, instead of being there with me, it could be there alone. And maybe then it could be taking the metro with someone else, etc. And then in different carts, and then by themselves, until they get to where they want to get. So only go to the next step once you've mastered the current step. Don't allow yourself to go too quickly. Don't allow yourself to be overexcited. So only go to the next step when the step you're in is conquered and mastered. And then what's going to happen is that the next step won't be that scary because you've conquered the current step. You work your way up like that until you master that. I gave you a very concrete example with a metro, but the truth is you can do this with pretty much anything that you're afraid of. Now, I want you to think of a typical situation where you start what-ifing. You know what I mean when I say that, right? What if this happens, and then what if that happens, and then what if, and next thing you know, you're like in your 10th what if. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you a few options of possible things that you do when you what if. By a show of hands, I want you to tell me what you do when you what if. Not what you think you should do, but what you actually do, okay? Who here thinks about it over and over and over and over and over and keeps what ifing? Okay. Who here problem solves? Okay. And who here lets it go? All right. Have a lot of work ahead of us. All right. So the next step, the next way we mismanage anxiety. So the first way we mismanage anxiety is by avoiding. The second way we mismanage anxiety is that we get confused about what actual problems are and what eventual problems are. Let me help you out a little bit. An actual problem is when an issue arises in reality. So you have a bill to pay. You have to pick a school for your child. You decide that you want to buy a house. Okay? These are things that in order for your anxiety to decrease, you need to problem solve. That's the only way your anxiety is going to decrease when you have an actual problem, is to step back, take a break, take out a pen and a paper, start problem solving, okay? And by problem solving, some can be very simple, like paying a bill, and others can be quite complicated, and you may actually need someone else to help you out, or a pen and a paper, brainstorming, generating solutions, etc. That's actual problems. Now, eventual problems. This is where things get a little bit more complicated. What's an eventual problem? It's something that hasn't happened yet and will probably not happen. You can usually recognize them because you're what-ifing. If you're what-ifing, you can usually put that in the bucket of eventual problems. Okay? So this is a typical one I hear. Somebody's going to go on vacation, and what if there's a snowstorm? And if there's a snowstorm, what if I miss my flight? And if I miss my flight, I may miss my connection and my luggage is not going to make it. And what if I miss the connection and my luggage doesn't make it? Or worse, my luggage actually makes it, but I don't? And then my friend is waiting for me and I'm not there, but my luggage is there, and that I see a lot of you nodding. Okay? These are called eventual problems. Now, what happens here is that a lot of you are either just going to keep what-ifing and the anxiety is going to rise. You're going to keep worrying and worrying as if it's helpful. And a lot of you are actually going to try and problem solve. The problem is that problem solving on a problem that doesn't exist, you spend a lot of energy and you don't create a lot of light. And the problem with problem solving is I think we're very socialized to see it as a very positive thing, but it can actually be quite negative when we problem solve on things that haven't happened. This is where I'm going to invite you to do something a little bit different and a little bit difficult. I want you to try and increase your tolerance to uncertainty. That's the strategy you need to use for eventual problems. It's the letting go part I was talking about. So to be able to do that, you need to first be able to recognize, is it an actual problem or an eventual problem? And to be honest with you, this is usually where the problem is that people are not able to put them in the right bucket. They put a lot of their eventual problems in the actual problem category, and then they start problem solving. If you become an expert at recognizing where they go, you're pretty much there. Because for an actual problem, you'll use problem solving. For an eventual problem, you're going to recognize it and allow yourself to increase your tolerance to uncertainty. Okay? Now, the third way we mismanage anxiety, and women do this a lot. So a lot of these things men do too, but we're much better at doing it and we have way more practice. So one of the problems with worrying is that we're actually socialized to believe that it's useful and it's a problem. So these are the things I hear a lot. It's worrying helps me problem solve and anticipate other things. Or worrying helps me prepare for the worst and it even avoids me feeling deceived. Another one I hear is it can actually maybe prevent the dreaded situation from happening, and maybe I'll even be able to protect loved ones if I worry about them. And then the other one I hear is, it's part of who I am. I'm a worrier. My parents were worriers. I just have to live with it. Yeah, it's not so much fun. I don't know if you've ever been around a worrier. They're not that much fun. So, what do we do with this? How do we kind of, what I'm telling you today is these are dysfunctional beliefs. What's the reality check? So what I'm going to say to you now is what I want you to start telling yourself or telling others when you hear them going through these dysfunctional beliefs. So worrying does not help you problem solve. Worrying does not help you problem solve. It doesn't help you. You know what helps you problem solve? Problem solving. I know it sounds simple, but when we're spinning our wheels, it's not that simple to get out of it. That's why I want you to think about this now. I want you to write it down now, because when you're going to be doing the what ifs, it's going to be hard for you to get out of that and get into a different mindset. Worrying doesn't help you be prepared. It'll only help you feel the stress for a longer time, and it'll only help you break down relationships around you. It's not fun to be around a worrier. Can you prevent things from happening or protect loved ones? No. It's kind of magical thinking a little bit. If you want to kind of protect people around you, think of creative ways where you can maybe be more proactive instead of just sitting there and spinning your wheels and worrying about that person. Just remind yourself that worrying about them is actually not really helping yourself or the other person. Now, the last one is, it's part of who I am. And I just told you that women are actually more vulnerable. So you're going to say, well, it is part of who I am. I'm a woman and I'm more vulnerable. So there you go. Yeah, you may be more vulnerable. You may not only be a woman, but you may be the fourth generation of anxiety disorders. I have that a lot in my office. My grandmother was like this, my mother was like this. And I'm said, okay, are you ready to break the cycle, or are we going to keep going? Right? You may be more vulnerable. That may be true. Doesn't matter. It's time to break the cycle. And you can, because anxiety, the thing is with anxiety, what I love about anxiety is it can really make you suffer a lot. And I've seen very, very severe cases. But the truth is that when you apply the strategies and when you commit, it actually works. That's the amazing thing about anxiety. The fourth way we mismanage anxiety is we ask for constant reassurance. Once again, women do this more than men. This is kind of a never-ending quest to try and reduce uncertainty in our lives, right? Remember I was talking about uncertainty before? So we kind of put our energy in the wrong place. We just want to reduce uncertainty by asking other people if what we're doing is okay. So we ask our loved ones, we ask our family doctor, we ask Google. I know because I know who those clients are because they ask me, I did this week, do you think it's okay? I'm thinking of booking this other thing, do you think that's fine? The last thing I do is answer them. I just let them marinate in their anxiety, right? Because I want them to become confident that they can actually tolerate that distress and that uncertainty. So be careful when you're constantly asking of other people to reassure you. And they mean well when they answer because they really love you. Or you really love them if you're the one who's asked to reassure the other person, right? But you're not helping them, you're just making them more dependent. Okay? And also what I often see is that these people are extremely afraid to not be able to cope if there's an unforeseen event. So they keep asking for reassurance and they keep wanting to reduce the uncertainty in their lives. But when I question them about their past history and when they've had unforeseen events and if they've been able to cope well, they're usually really good. It's kind of like they forget. If you review your past history and you look at when you've had to deal with unforeseen events, chances are you realize you were actually quite okay. So there's no need to worry about that. If something happens, you'll probably be able to deal with it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are life values. Now, this is a notion that's become really kind of important in the last few years. It comes from a type of therapy that we call acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's quite interesting because the idea here is to basically ask people what's important to them, what their values are, what has meaning to them. And basically when you take this as a canvas for change, so let's say you're really afraid of something and I'm asking you as your therapist to do something really uncomfortable. If your values are really clear for you and you know that getting through this fear will allow you to get closer to your values, you'll be able to really keep going through that process and you'll be able to really find more meaning. I even have clients sometimes who, when I ask them about their values, they tell me they don't have any. I don't buy it. It's just because they've been so anxious for so long that they're just surviving at this point. They just want to get away from the distress. If you take a moment and you think about what's important to you, you'll be able to kind of get away from that mindset of just wanting to survive. And you'll be able to start moving forward towards what's important to you. Now, how many of you still think that worrying is useful? Okay, that's good. How many of you are going to try facing your fears in the way I described today? All right. I'm going to ask you one more thing. I'm going to ask you to do one more thing for the ones who raised your hand. I'm going to ask you to actually share that tonight when you get home. Share that with somebody you love. Tell them about the process. Tell them what you're committing to and make them an ally. And don't let them, just have an ally and allow them to kind of follow you through this process, because when you commit out loud, it's so powerful. Now, what's the takeaway from the last 30 minutes? Are we more vulnerable? Yeah, we are. Can we make anxiety more productive instead of destructive? We sure can. Now, before getting rid of your stress, I would encourage you to take a few minutes and just rethink about what's important to you. Not what's important to other people, what's important to you right now with the lifestyle you have today. Not what you thought was important to you, not what was important to you 10 years ago or 20 years from now. What's important to you right now. And every day, are you moving towards that or away from that? And what's preventing you to move towards that? So that's the life values part that I was telling you about. I think that the more honest you are about this process, the easier it will be for you to set and to achieve your goals before you know it. And I think that sooner rather than later, you will be able to inspire other women to do the same. Thank you. When we're used to feeling anxious or we're afraid, is we'll sometimes interpret any response as anxiety. So if you think of feeling excited, it actually looks a lot like anxiety. But when we're very afraid of anxiety, sometimes we feel excited and we throw it into the anxiety bucket. And we forget to think maybe it's not anxiety, maybe it's something else. So I think there's actually quite a lot of positive, and there's it can be uncomfortable and it can be distressing, but it's not dangerous.
So getting closer to it in a more honest way is one of the things that you've been talking about quite a bit. Now, you talked at the end about how identifying your values is an important aspect of that. And how do you really go about doing that, particularly if you're at a stage where you don't see many values anymore? You can't remember what they were exactly.
Right.
How do you go through those steps?
So I have a very specific exercise that I use with my clients, and they actually like this very much. What I ask them to do is I ask them to just make a list of life areas. So usually we get about from anywhere from 5 to 10. And when I say life areas, I mean something very general. So work, family, social life, leisure, spiritual life, etc. It's kind of up to you to come up with them, okay? Once you make that list, you basically rate how important each area is to you. So something simple, let's say 1, 2, or 3. 1, not important. 2, moderately. 3, very important. So you rate your life areas, and then I ask you to go through the same list again with the same rating scale, but this time I ask you to tell me how satisfied you are in each area. So usually when we see that there's a problem is when there's an area where it's very important to you, so you have a 3, but then I have a 1 in terms of satisfaction. So this is when there's a huge gap, and this is where usually there's going to be a lot of distress. So when you see that, when the client is kind of facing this thing where, oh my gosh, my parenting area is really important, but I'm at a 1, what's preventing me from getting there? This is when we can start talking about your fears and about anxiety.
Right, and these are the kinds of things you can do yourself too, just as a general exercise.
Of course.
Even
of course.
Before coming to see you.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're actually making me think of a good example regarding values. Last week, I was in the car coming back. I was bringing my kids from school to the house. And I asked my kids, I said, listen, guys, tonight I need you to find kind of a quiet activity because I need to work on a presentation that I'm doing next week. Yes. And then my daughter says, Mommy, what presentation? I said, well, I'm going to talk about women and anxiety. And, there's going to be a lot of people, and it's going to be on the internet and on TV. And then she says, oh, Mommy, I would never show off that way. And then I thought, okay. But then she keeps talking, and she says, I would be way too shy. I thought, this is my cue. I've been waiting for this. So I said, listen, I'm shy too. I'm actually quite stressed and anxious about doing this presentation. I'm even having physical sensations. But I said, you know what? Then I thought about why I chose to be a psychologist. And one of the main reasons is because I love to transfer knowledge. It's really one of my passions. So when I got the call about doing this presentation, I knew I really wanted to do it even though I was really scared. Then there's complete silence, and then I'm like, okay, well, I tried. And then about 30 seconds later, she says, oh, Mommy, I think I get it. What you're saying is that you didn't let the worry win. I said, exactly. She said it in one sentence. It took me about 5 minutes to explain that. But that's exactly what I meant, is I didn't let the worry win because there was something so much more important to me.
That's a very good example, actually, that we can very much relate to. Another question I had for you is, it's all good and well and say face your fears and go ahead and do it, and it should be pretty standard. And you talked about the gradual way of getting to that. But worried people will tell you, well, what if that doesn't work?
It's true. They do say that. Well, I do have, and to be fair, I do have clients who actually follow the steps. I feel like I'm in AA. They do follow the steps to do the gradual exposure, and it doesn't work. And I'll tell you about two kind of examples that I usually find in the clients where it doesn't work. The first one is because they do it physically. So if you were to watch them and film them, they're doing it perfectly. But their mind is still anxious. They're still using a bunch of distraction strategies. So they're sitting in the metro, but they're just thinking, oh, I'm in Cuba, I'm having a margarita. They're just not there. They're either distracting or they're still extremely anxious. They're still convinced that what they're doing is very dangerous. They're not being mindful about what they're doing. They're not allowing themselves to kind of feel the distress and to accept what they're going through. So this is the first example where I see people who do it really well, but they don't get the results that they want. The other type of client where it's sometimes difficult is when I find that they have a performance mindset instead of a learning mindset. And a performance mindset is when you're basically very focused on doing it perfectly or failing, right? There's like two options in a performance mindset. It's either success or failure. So the client is really focused on the results and on kind of not looking too silly. Now, what I would invite you to do is to adopt a learning mindset. What do we do in a learning mindset is we value effort. In a learning mindset, there's actually no such thing as failure because you can always learn something. Think about when you learn a sport or a language. You have to allow yourself to be a beginner. And to be a beginner means it's sometimes uncomfortable, you sometimes look silly in front of others even. So if you don't allow yourself to do that as you're facing your fears and you're stuck in a performance mindset, you're going to fail. You are going to fail because you're not going to do it perfectly. You have no practice. You've been avoiding this your entire life and suddenly you think you're going to be an expert? Makes no sense. So if you can adopt a learning mindset, I think it could really kind of help you face those fears and kind of get through those obstacles.
The gradual steps that you were talking about. Now, I just want to pick up on the issue of learning to sort of maybe switch towards younger women. Okay, so we're an audience of mostly adults, I think. But what about our young women who we are either seeing as developing anxiety problems, a lot of self-esteem issues, a lot of performance anxiety.
Yes.
I'm certainly seeing this in a lot of my students that are coming in. What can we do either as parents or teachers to help support our young ones without putting too much attention to the issue of the anxiety?
So I think part of the answer is definitely the performance and learning mindset. So even though we all understand that and we go like this, when our kid gets home and doesn't have an A+, we switch into performance mindset. This is where we need to be careful. Even when your child gets an A+ and you're super proud, you can still praise the effort. You can still praise how much they've studied. You can still praise how hard they've worked. So I think this is the first thing we can do as parents or teachers, is to really kind of switch a little bit towards the learning mindset and teach our kids and our young women that this is the part that's important. Now, the good news is when we talk about anxiety disorders, I mentioned anxiety disorders a little bit at the beginning, they're usually expressed in pretty similar ways in kids. So the strategies to cope with them or to treat them are actually pretty similar. Now, it could get tricky when they're in school because usually that's where the anxiety is going to be expressed and you're not there as a parent. So this is when you need to pick up on things like your child getting very anxious about doing an exam, or suddenly your child not wanting to do a presentation, not wanting to eat at the cafeteria. Now, the last thing you want to do is tell them that it's going to be okay, because then your child is just going to become more anxious because he or she feels that you're actually not getting this at all. What you need to do is to sit down, have a conversation about it, and just allow them to go all the way to the end of their fear, you know? And then what would happen? And then what do you think would happen? And is that realistic? And when you did it last time, was it really like that? So just start from the premise that you believe them, and then just kind of go through the steps. Another thing that's very useful is, you know, we talked about gradual exposure before. Do this with your kids. You know, I know a lot of kids right now in my kids' school who get extremely stressed about these little exams they do in math where they're timed. Do this at home. Do it at home. Do the timing at home to build their confidence, not their performance, to build their confidence. When they have presentations, make them present in front of you, make them present in front of the neighbor, in front of their stuffed animals, whatever it takes. You're building on their confidence, not their performance. You praise them on their confidence and on their effort. So this is a very good way and a very friendly way to help them out. And of course, if you feel that it gets chronic and it's not working, you really need to seek help. Because the more chronic it gets, the more also they're going to get behind in school, and then they can really get in trouble.
Yeah, and this is true for pretty much all ages, right? Or even very young kids that we see.
Yes.
Oh, I can't go to school, I'm sick, or that happens on a regular basis. These same kinds of exercises can be brought to them,
Of
too.
course, and when they often, and that's true, very small kids sometimes will talk about physical symptoms. And as parents, I think we have a tendency to say, okay, let's bring them to the doctor, bring them to the doctor, everything's fine. Have it in your radar that maybe it's anxiety, to open up the conversation.
I also wanted to touch base on we've talked a lot about, what we call cognitive measures of thinking through, going through anxiety problems or facing our fears or the worrisome that we have. What are other types of approaches we could think of rather than the whole analytic thinking process that we've gone through tonight?
Right. So there's a lot of other strategies I use with my client which are not as psychological. One of them is going to sound very old school, but relaxation. And I'll tell you why. One of the strategies I really like is called progressive muscle relaxation. And what you do with this type of strategy is that you take different muscle groups, and what you do is you tense them and then you relax them. And the reason I like this strategy is because a lot of my chronic worriers or my chronic anxiety people, they've been anxious for so long that they don't even remember what it feels like to not be anxious. So the fact that you're forcing them to tense their muscles and then relax actually reminds them and retrains their brain to remember what it feels like to not be anxious. So when you go through this strategy as you scan your body, you start relearning what it feels like to not be anxious. And why is that important? Because I want you to become an expert at discriminating those two states. So when you're going into a meeting room, you're going to know right away when you start raising your shoulders, when you start tensing your back. So you'll be able to pick it up and relax right away. Another strategy I like, and it's a little bit similar in a way, it's very physical, is breathing, diaphragmatic breathing. When you're anxious, when you're on the fight or flight, what do? You breathe with your chest. Makes a lot of sense if there's a bear in the room, sure. But when nothing really threatening is there, you don't need to breathe that way. And diaphragmatic breathing teaches you to breathe through your stomach. Same thing. The reason I like this strategy, it's because it teaches you to discriminate. The minute you start breathing with your chest, you know that's not the right way to breathe, and it's just going to make you feel more and more anxious, and it's going to make you have more and more symptoms. So if you can just switch that breathing, it's going to be very helpful. Two more things I like is, one is bibliotherapy. Sounds a little bit boring. Yeah, reading books, getting knowledge. What you guys are doing tonight. Knowledge is power. If you don't know, how can you do better? How can you do different? I know it can be daunting to be in the self-help section. Don't be shy to ask your friends, to ask professionals, to even go on Google, not to look at the ratings, but to look at the reviews, because the reviews will tell you what's in the book. What are you looking for? For a workbook? For information? For something on values? So start from there. And I kept the last one is my favorite one, physical activity. Now, in the last few years, there's been so much research showing that physical activity has benefits for mental health. There are just no drawbacks. I know I don't need to convince you that physical activity is good. What I need to convince you of is to put it in your schedule. We now know that exercising 3 times a week for 30 minutes is just as effective as antidepressants. That's huge. It's huge. I now put this in all the treatment plans of most of my clients, and I've yet to have a negative comment. What it does for your mental health is really something. Not even to say what it does for your physical health, for your, self-esteem, even interpersonal relationships. So that, for me, would be right now my kind of top strategy that's not a psychological strategy.
Right. You were you were mentioning issues around panic attacks. We haven't touched that much. But can you give us an idea of what a panic attack is for those who don't know? And how to detect the signs early and work with those signs?
So a panic attack, it's such an interesting question. A panic attack in itself is not a problem. About 30% of you here are going to have at least one panic attack in your lives. A panic attack is just kind of a surge of adrenaline. It's kind of excess fight or flight. And it happens to all of us. And to be honest with you, often it happens a little bit randomly. But because we can't tolerate the fact that such a big reaction is random, we find reasons for it. So if we happen to have a panic attack and we were in the bus, we stop taking the bus. This is when panic attacks become a problem. This is when we start talking about an anxiety disorder. When you start fearing your panic attack, or when you start avoiding places because you're afraid of having a panic attack, that's when it becomes a problem. Now, what's a panic attack? It's basically a surge of anxiety. Well, you have a bunch of physical symptoms. So it can be shaking, blurry vision, sweating, shortness of breath. I mean, there's about 15 possible physical reactions. You only need 4 of them to fill the criteria in the psychiatric manual. And it'll usually go away in about 10 minutes. So when people tell me I had a panic attack for 4 hours, they didn't have a panic attack, they had something else. But a panic attack should usually go away in about 10 minutes. When it becomes a problem too is when people think that avoiding helps them not have a panic attack. The truth is, whether you avoid or not, the panic attack will go away. But you don't know that because you run away, so you think that that's what helped you stop it. Right.
And maybe one last question. I don't know how much time we have left at this point, 5 minutes.
Okay.
Maybe 2 other questions then. I'm enjoying this part of where I can ask you questions. So we've talked about panic attacks. We've talked about different stages to help through anxiety. And what is the difference between anxiety and phobia?
Okay. So anxiety is, I think, pretty much what we've been discussing. So it's kind of this feeling of, I'm afraid a little bit, I want to avoid, I'm feeling uncomfortable. You know, you're with your husband and you're like, oh, I'm feeling stressed about this presentation. That's anxiety.
It's coming a lot.
Yes. I'm finally able to talk about it. I feel so much better. Phobia is different. Phobia is, let's say I have a phobia of spiders and I see a spider, I cannot contain myself. I would actually get up, scream, and leave. It's way more intense. Your life starts revolving around not seeing whatever you're phobic about. So what happens is, if you're exposed to it, the distress is extremely high. And when you don't have to be exposed to it, you actively avoid it as much as you can. So it's a much stronger reaction to something that just thinking about it can actually spike your anxiety.
Right, and is that also more often in women than it is in men? Or is it depends on the types of phobias?
Clinically, I've seen a lot more women having phobias. But I don't know what the prevalence would be in terms of men and women.
In terms of types, probably differences. There's another question I've wanted to ask you, because we've heard a lot of women talk about this syndrome. And maybe some of you know about this. It's called the imposter syndrome. Do you know about that? Somebody's laughing behind me. I guess it's either been there or saw that.
Maybe we can have her up
Yes.
there.
So, first of all, maybe we could describe what the imposter syndrome is, but how is that related or unrelated to anxiety? Because it seems to be more frequent with women who are particularly meticulous or perfectionist or things of that sort.
And it's interesting because I think that as women are feeling more empowered and as they're being more successful, and there's been kind of a big wave of this with books like Lean In, and I don't know if any of you have read it. There's been usually people who feel the imposter syndrome are women who are quite successful. And what it is, when we talk about it in more kind of therapeutic terms, it's a kind of inability or difficulty to to kind of interpret our success as something internal. So what happens with people who have the imposter syndrome is that they'll say things like, well, I got to where I am because I got lucky, or because somebody gave me a break, or because my boss likes me, or because, do you see how everything is external? It has nothing to do with me. So it's like you got there, but it's not really, you're not really responsible for it. So it's often been seen in research as kind of a personality trait or a vulnerability. I wouldn't say it's directly related to anxiety, but I'm sure it creates a lot of anxiety. And this is often what happens too, actually, with anxiety, is that most issues actually at some point will create anxiety, but it doesn't mean it's an anxiety disorder, or it doesn't mean it stems from anxiety. Like the imposter syndrome, I'm sure, creates anxiety, right? But it's not really kind of an anxiety disorder or anything like that.
Right, anxiety becomes one of the consequences of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So maybe I'll wrap up on that. Thank you very much for answering my questions. And I will thank Dr. Munoz very, very much for her very enlightening and dynamic presentation. So please join me in thanking her for this.
Thank you.